Alright, so this lesson will be all about rendering. Number one, make sure that optimize big volumetric grids is enabled. It is enabled by default, but if you disable this and you have a big scene with a big smoke plume like we do have now, your rendering might take up to a minute longer. So just make sure that this is checked. Just do a V-Ray next. And then under V-Ray, I always like to do bucket, one minimum subdiv, one maximum. Then usually for your final render, you could do something like 4 max subdivs, but for now we're gonna do 2. And then under light cache, you can just leave it at 1000. And let's give it an HD resolution of maybe 1280 by 720 and run a render just to see how long it'll take. So this render finished in 10 seconds. So I'm gonna hit Ctrl C to create a camera so we work with the same scene all the time. And then let's add some lights. So as you know, you can either add a V-Ray sun based on the previous lessons like I showed you, or what I like to do is just create a few V-Ray lights like this. So I would just make one of them stronger. So maybe this one can have a multiplier of 5 and make sure that it's options, invisible, and rotate that 90 and put that maybe over here and point it down onto the explosion. You can hit W, hold shift, drag, and I like to make the other one less intensity just to create some more contrast in the explosion. So I would maybe do this one multiplier 2.5, so that's half, and put that on this side. And then we can do again standard V-Ray, and let's add a V-Ray plane again so we have some floor. And let's give it a standard V-Ray material and maybe make sure that it's a bit darker gray and apply that to our V-Ray plane. And let's run one more render. Okay, so this one took 1 minute and 9 seconds, but it is much nicer. I just think that the light coming from the left is a bit too strong and I want that fire to shine through a bit more. So I'm gonna move this light further back. And you can see in the GPU preview the kind of shading that you're getting. So I kind of want to get more shadow in the front over here. And I'm going to lower the intensity of this light to maybe just 1. And then I'm going to move this one further back as well, just to give it that sort of rim light. So one of the main things you can do to speed up your rendering is by playing with this step percent and shadow percent. So all you need to know really is that the higher these numbers are, the faster the rendering will be. However, the more artifacts you're going to introduce. So if the step percent is over 100, you're probably gonna start getting some artifacts. So just for fun, let's make this 200 and run the rendering and see what's gonna happen. All right, so this rendered in 56 seconds, so about 15 seconds less than it did before. But I feel like I can definitely see some reduction in quality of the explosion. However, I think a lot of it is also because we're rendering the floor. So I'm gonna hide the V-Ray plane floor for now, just so that the rendering is faster. So this rendered in 15 seconds with step percent 200 and shadow step 200. So let's make the step percent 50, which should give us a nicer quality, but should take longer, and run the rendering. Alright, so we went up in about 5 seconds compared to the previous one by lowering the step percent to 50. So let me reduce the shadow step percent to 100 and run the rendering. And we went up by another 5 seconds from 20 to almost 25 by reducing the shadow step percent from 200 to 100. So again, just to reiterate, the lower these numbers, the higher quality you're gonna get, but the longer it's gonna take. The higher these numbers, the lower quality you're gonna get, but the shorter amount of time it's gonna take. So if I wanted to speed up my rendering, I could maybe make the step percent 150 and the shadow step maybe 250, but I'm risking introducing some artifacts. However, if you've been watching, you can see that the explosion looks about the same all the time, even if we're changing these numbers. So it's possible that only when it starts moving, you would see some actual artifacts. So it's something that you have to test, but these are the main two settings that you can use to speed up your renders. And of course, all of this works in conjunction with your actual render settings in V-Ray. So if you are getting some artifacts and some noise in the shadow areas, it's possible that your subdifs are simply too low in V-Ray. So for your final rendering, I recommend that you would make the final subdifs 3 or 4. And then you can also raise the light cache. I mean, you might be using a different, you might be using a radiance map here or whatever else you're used to. But I would usually just stick to brute force and light cache, and you can make the subdifs maybe 2500, and that usually helps to eliminate a lot of noise. So these would be my final render settings. I would do 1 and 4, and then I would do maybe 2500 for the light cache, and that usually gets me pretty nice results, and maybe 1920 by 1080 for resolution. Now, one more thing I want to mention, I've seen people post online saying that they can see the individual voxels in their simulation, they can see the squares, even though their resolution is really high. And sometimes it's because of this sampler type. So if you're running into an issue where you can see sort of a pixelization or squares or voxels, whatever you want to call it, you might want to switch the sampler type to spherical, and that usually takes care of any of those issues. So that's it for rendering, and in the next lesson we're going to talk about compositing explosions with fire and smoke separately.